Walking up. Okay, the Rules Committee will come to order. Today we are taking up two bills, H.R. 2203 and H.R. 3525, to strengthen oversight at the border and ensure migrants receive the humane care that they deserve. We're also taking up a resolution in reaction to recent news that should trouble every American, a whistleblower complaint hidden from Congress alleging that President Trump used the power of his presidency to urge a foreign power to investigate a political rival. Some suggest maybe at the condition of receiving foreign aid, but quite frankly, the mere fact that the President of the United States called a foreign country and asked them to manufacture dirt on a potential political opponent, I think is a betrayal of his oath of office. More details will come out since the administration up to this point has refused to turn over the complaint to Congress, despite the law requiring to do so, and despite the Inspector General's determination that it is credible and related to a matter of urgent concern. The President may not like it, but Congress has constitutionally mandated oversight responsibilities. This resolution reiterates the simple fact that the President and his administration, including the Acting Director of National Intelligence, needs to follow the law. We are a nation of laws, period, not just when it is convenient for President Trump. This resolution is really that simple. I don't care what party you are or who you voted for in the last election or even who you want to see win the next one. This isn't about politics. This is about the rule of law, and I hope that all members can support this. And now let me turn it over to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the committee is considering three bills. The first two are H.R. 2203 and H.R. 3525, both of which concern immigration and both of which have been the subject of repeated and extensive rewrites. Our third bill is a last-minute and politically motivated non-binding resolution concerning a subpoena relating to a recent whistleblower complaint regarding President Trump. I'll address the two Homeland Security bills first. In both cases, the bills that have come to the rules have changed significantly since they were reported out of committee, the Committee on Homeland Security. Despite all the changes to the bill text, I think the most important thing to point out about these bills is what they don't do. Neither bill addresses the fundamental challenges on our southern border. Neither bill provides for additional border security, which the American people have repeatedly told us they want. And neither bill provides the additional resources that the government needs to address the humanitarian crisis. Instead, these bills propose policies that really will do nothing to fix the problems we are facing. The manager's amendment to H.R. 2203 establishes an ombudsman at the Department of Homeland Security. This person is supposed to be empowered to investigate and resolve complaints at the Department of Homeland Security concerning customs and border protection and immigration and customs enforcement. But since the bill also does not empower the new official to actually resolve complaints, and since it does not provide funding for this new position, I'm skeptical that H.R. 2203 will have any real effect. H.R. 3525, by contrast, asks the Department of Homeland Security to do the impossible. The bill requires the department to establish a system of electronic health records for individuals detained by DHS on the border. However, it does not provide any funding for doing so, and it requires DHS to have this new system up and running within 90 days. I spend a lot of time working with the Department of Health and Human Services, and I can tell you in my experience that electronic health record systems are expensive and deeply complex information technology projects that take time and resources to complete. Asking DHS to set up a new system like this with no funding and on such a short timeline is simply setting up the department to fail. For that reason, I believe this bill, too, is going nowhere. Mr. Chairman, while I'm encouraged to see the majority actually acknowledge the crisis on the southern border, a welcome change from only 90 days ago, I think the House needs to get serious about solutions that actually address the pressing challenges. There's a desperate need to strengthen security at the southern border, and the Departments of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services need additional resources to address the humanitarian and security crisis. Neither of these bills provides the fixes or resources needed. Separate from my significant concerns on the Homeland Security measures is the absolute abysmal process that has led us to consider HRES 576. 1 hour and 45 minutes ago, minority members on the House Rules and Intelligence Committees received notice that we would also be meeting on a measure that has just introduced. In that 1 hour and 45 minutes, minority members were expected to read and deliberate on the 8-page resolution, secure a witness to testify on the substance, and ensure that they are informed enough to cast a vote. Additionally, a mere 30 minutes ago, the Senate unanimously agreed to a resolution to move in a bipartisan fashion and ensure that the Senate Intelligence Committee receives the whistleblower complaint in question. Just this afternoon, we also learned that Chairman Schiff is working to secure a closed-door meeting with the whistleblower in question. We also know that the acting director of national intelligence is testifying before the House Intelligence Committee this week. Why does this matter? Because once again, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are rejecting the deliberative bipartisan path toward conducting robust, meaningful oversight in favor of capitalizing on a perceived political wind shifting in their favor. This, like other similar resolutions the House has tackled this Congress, reeks of political gamesmanship. In their zeal to discredit the president, the majority appears to have already decided what the facts will be. I would submit to the majority that this resolution is a politically motivated but pointless exercise. And if the majority insists on going down this road, it will simply guarantee Congress will not be productive on things that could actually benefit the American people, and will guarantee that nothing else gets done this Congress, especially nothing bipartisan. Countless times now, this Congress, the majority has wasted time and energy on fruitless investigations of the president. Each time we are told that surely this hearing, this witness, this subpoena will change the game. Yet after 9 months of House investigations and 2 years of a special counsel, the Democrats still insist on wasting time with these partisan activities and have no concerns about completely trashing regular order in the process. We would be much better served, Mr. Chairman, if we focused our oversight efforts in pursuit of truth and facts rather than political gamesmanship. And rather than allowing partisanship to dictate priorities, it's time we come together and focus our efforts on areas that truly would benefit the American people. Trade agreements like the USMCA, dealing with the prescription drug prices, or addressing the security situation on the southern border. All those areas would be productive, and all of them would be bipartisan. Instead, we run in circles, perpetually chasing our own tail and perpetually wasting time and energy on this pointless exercise. We can and should do better than that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. And again, I just want to restate for the record, I think we're in a different point right now. I mean, the president, by his own admission, he said this, that he asked a foreign government to make up dirt, manufacture dirt on his opponent, potential opponent, to influence an American election. It may not bother everybody on this panel. It certainly bothers me. And I think we have an obligation to respond appropriately, and I think this is one way to do that. At this point, I would like to welcome Mr. Schiff and Dr. Wenstrup to the committee. We're delighted that you are here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentleman from California, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. I appreciate your consideration of House Resolution 576 on an expedited basis. I think such treatment is fully warranted, and I suspect many members will agree, for these are extraordinary circumstances. A great deal is at stake for the protection of lawful whistleblowers, for intelligence oversight, and for Congress's ability to identify and root out violations of law, policy, and abuses of power. It is therefore right that this committee and the House will quickly take up this matter. The resolution explains that a whistleblower made a protected disclosure on August 12th to the Inspector General of the intelligence community that the Inspector General determined to be a credible and urgent concern. As required by statute, the Inspector General transmitted that complaint along with his determination to the Acting Director of National Intelligence. Contrary to the statute, the Acting Director of National Intelligence has refused and continues to refuse to transmit the complaint to the Congressional Intelligence Committees. The Acting Director of National Intelligence has also refused to produce the complaint to the House Intelligence Committee pursuant to a subpoena. In light of these extraordinary and unprecedented, treatment of a whistleblower complaint, this resolution calls upon the Acting Director to immediately forward the whistleblower complaint and accompanying materials to the Congressional Intelligence Committees, immediately provide the whistleblower any necessary direction on how to contact the Congressional Committees directly and in accordance with appropriate security practices, immediately comply with the House Intel Committee's subpoena for documents, and immediately take affirmative public steps to ensure that the whistleblower and any other person with relevant information be fully protected from reprisal or threats of reprisal. The resolution further calls on the Acting Director of National Intelligence, Department of Justice, and the White House to preserve records and information related to the whistleblower complaint and the decision to withhold the complaint from the Congressional Intelligence Committees. Finally, the resolution calls on the President, his associates, and senior officials in the administration to cease their public efforts to attack the whistleblower and others who may have knowledge of the allegations of the complaint. I will close by noting that the Senate resolution calling for the whistleblower complaint to be released immediately to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees passed unanimously earlier this afternoon, a clear indication of strong bipartisan support, at least in the Senate. In light of this development, I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle support this resolution in the House. The last thing I would say, Mr. Chairman, is that all of our committees are heavily dependent on the whistleblower process. Our committee, the Intelligence Committee, is particularly dependent on whistleblowers because, unlike the other committees that operate in open session, our committee operates largely in closed session in which outside parties are not present to be able to tell us if what the intelligence agencies are representing is not correct. We are reliant on the intelligence community to self-report, and generally they do, but when they don't, we are completely reliant on whistleblowers. If the experience, and it's now been well over a month since this complaint was filed, was that the process is a sham, that even the subject of the complaint may have a role in determining whether that complaint is ever shared with the Congress, then the system will be irrevocably broken, which will mean that other whistleblowers will either refuse to come forward and we'll never learn of misconduct, or they'll take matters into their own hands and they will go to the press with classified information presenting a whole host of other risks. So there's a lot at stake here. If the allegations are correct that this complaint in fact involves the matters, Chairman, that you were mentioning, that it involves the President of the United States seeking to badger a foreign president to manufacture dirt on his opponent, the gravity is all the greater. So I would hope that we could, on a bipartisan basis, support a resolution, as indeed the Senate just has, to require this complaint to be turned over immediately. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wenstrup. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarification, if I could. In your opening statement, you implied that you were quoting the President of the United States in his conversation with the President of the Ukraine. Was that a quote that you've obtained?
No, I was basically characterizing what the President said, that he had a conversation with a foreign country in which he essentially asked that leader to manufacture dirt on a potential opponent. I find that
Thank you.
genuinely disturbing.
You said essentially, and that's what I needed to hear, because you didn't say that, I don't think, the first time you said that that is what he said. And I just want to clarify that for the record. Because I was wondering how you would have gotten the quote when it hasn't.
I listened to the news and I saw the President basically said.
That's going to get to my point, that you listened to the news. So here are the facts that we know at the moment. The whistleblower is an intelligence community employee, detailee, or contractor. The complaint involves classified information, and the whistleblower sought to follow the statutory disclosure process to disclose the information to Congress in a responsible manner. The majority has gotten some spun up on the news articles citing unnamed sources purporting to contain details about the whistleblower's complaint. Any facts other than those I've already stated are mere conjecture. But the point deserves repeating. We do not have any additional facts at this time, and therefore this resolution is extremely premature. We are in favor of proceeding as appropriate. The chairman is right. The whistleblower process is important to the intelligence community and to the work that we do. But we should not be puppets of the news. We should act on facts as we know them. And I think that's important in our democratic process. Now, the acting director of national intelligence sought a legal opinion from the Department of Justice, again, on a subject matter unknown and unconfirmed, because he perceived there was a jurisdictional issue that needed to be resolved. And we should hear from the director of national intelligence. The majority are using this resolution to make a political statement, not conduct honest oversight in due course. Evidence that the Democrats are handling this in bad form is illustrated by the fact that the majority didn't even receive a copy of the text of this resolution until about an hour ago. Our committee has heard from the Inspector General for the intelligence community, but have not gotten to hear Acting Director McGuire's side of the story. And we'll have that opportunity to hear from Acting Director on Thursday. If we heard from the Director of National Intelligence first, and only the Director of National Intelligence, would it be appropriate to act without hearing from the IG? I think you all would agree that that would not be appropriate. And that's the situation that we're in right now. We should reserve judgment on this matter until we hear from Acting Director McGuire on Thursday morning at his scheduled appearance before the House Intelligence Committee. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And again, let me repeat, I was characterizing what the President himself said and what his personal attorney said about his involvement in asking a foreign government to dig up, to manufacture dirt on a potential opponent. I don't know, I find that troublesome, to say the least, but I think it is a betrayal of his oath of office. That's my opinion. I appreciate your comments, and I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hayes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm at a loss to determine what we in the majority are supposed to do when the administration takes it upon itself to not inform the majority in the House of Representatives and all members of the House of Representatives about a complaint that has been determined to be credible by the Inspector General. And it should be noted that the Inspector General is a nonpartisan person and doesn't have dogs in these fights. And then there were statutory requirements that were not followed, yet we find ourselves being accused of being political, when in fact, this is not the first instance of the administration stonewalling the Democrats' opportunity for oversight. I won't go into the litany of times that this administration, where various committees, Mr. Schiff's committee, Mr. Cummings's committee, Mr. Nadler's committee, and the Foreign Affairs Committee, all have sought information from this administration. And I believe any of us that have not just on the subject matter at hand, but to show that this administration disregards regular order and the rule of law and the Constitution. I have written letters to various cabinet officials in the course of the 116th Congress, and with the exception of one of the 7 letters that I know that I authored, I have received no information from the cabinet officials that I directed queries to, totally unrelated to this particular subject matter. We're in rather grave times, and all of us on both sides of the aisle have an exacting responsibility to protect the statutory confines of the whistleblower. From my dear friend from Oklahoma says that, you know, we're getting ahead of ourselves, characterizing by seeking this information. Well, the whistleblower did what the whistleblower was required to do under the law, and those are the facts. And the Inspector General did what the Inspector General was required to do under the law. And now we find ourselves in, rather than in 7 days as the statute requires, the information being provided to the respective committees of jurisdiction, we have the Justice Department with, and quote me on this, with the toady that's in charge of the Justice Department. And yes, I do mean it when I say that, because his actions suggest to me that he is not being anything other than partisan in his actions of stonewalling. Now, we can't continue this way. This isn't the only time that Mr. Schiff's committee or other committees have sought information and have been denied that information. Witnesses have been subpoenaed and have been told by this administration that they don't have to testify. And I don't know how we are supposed to conduct our business when we find ourselves in a situation like this. I had been very reluctant as a member of Congress. I think I know more about impeachment than damn near everybody in Congress. I was impeached. And so I understand it as political. So there's nothing that can be gained by us accusing each other of doing what is required. Impeachment is a political process. It is not one where you need criminality. And in order for us to get the facts, we have to have cooperation from this administration. And I don't find that we're getting that cooperation, and therefore this resolution is more than appropriate for the circumstances that we are confronted with. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions of either of our witnesses, and I appreciate your indulgence in allowing me to go forward. I had until today said that I did not want to go down the road of impeachment, but not only should Donald Trump be impeached, he should be removed from office. In our face, he has conducted criminality. And I'm talking in the face of everybody. What was that with the foreign minister of Russia and the ambassador of Russia in the White House? What was that he said? I looked at it, I saw it, and I read the Mueller report. I don't know how many of you did read it. I read it once and a portion of a second time. And clearly it sets forth obstruction of justice. So I don't know where we need to go. I don't know that we are going to be able to get where we need to be. But I'm on record now as saying this man should be impeached and he should be removed from office. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. I have great respect for my good friend from Florida, but I think we ought to have a proceeding before we decide what the outcome is going to be. Mr. Schiff, when did you hear of this resolution? Did you write it yourself?
We had some earlier discussions this week about a resolution on this topic. We understood also the Senate may pursue a resolution along these lines. And part of the reason for the expedition, Mr. Cole, is the Inspector General confirmed to us the urgency involved here. This is already something that Congress was supposed to be informed about weeks ago. And in the absence of pressure brought to bear to have the DNI do his job, then there's an urgent matter that is going completely unaddressed.
Well, that's not quite the answer to my question. When did you see the resolution, and did you write it yourself?
We worked on the contents of the resolution. We had a part in drafting the resolution in consultation with others. So yes.
When did that begin?
Within the last 24 to 48 hours.
And you couldn't inform the minority about it at all until an hour and 45 minutes ago?
The minority, I would imagine, because the Senate was engaged in the same thing, would have the same information that we are, that this was being pursued.
But you didn't bother, look, I just got this thing. And so I didn't have a chance to read it. I've got to comment on it. I'm going to have to vote on it.
And Mr.
If
Cole-
you've been working on it for a couple of days, I just thought it would have been okay to at least inform somebody that this was coming.
Mr. Cole, I would hope that you and my Republican colleagues on the committee would take this as seriously as we do.
I do.
and I
I
would
take
hope-
it
and I-
seriously
and I
enough
would-
to
and-
take the
and-
time to consider it before I act.
Well, the Senate has already acted. The Republicans in the Senate, Mr. Cole, believe this was sufficiently urgent that they were ready to act on unanimous
That's
consent.
fine. I'm not a United States Senator. I would like to know if a House body is working on a resolution like this and have that communicated to the minority members on your committee.
And I would like to have the Republican members of the House, including on our committee, be speaking out about the importance of following the law when it
I
comes to
think
whistleblowers.
they probably want to wait and see what the resolution is. I understand the full transcript is going to be released tomorrow. I mean, this seems to me extraordinarily precipitous. And it looks to me, honestly, like it's much more a response to your 4 o'clock caucus than it is to any kind of serious consideration at all, let alone normal courtesy in letting your counterparts know what you're doing. Because this, I mean, we didn't get this any time to consider it in any kind of systematic way, and yet we're going to vote on it here, and it's going to head to the floor.
Yes, but you have been aware, and I don't know if you've spoken out about it or remained silent about it.
I
but
actually
you
would,
have- you-
what
you-
I've said is I would like to wait and see the documents, the whistleblower complaint and the actual transcript, which I understand
well,
may
then
be
this-
headed in our direction
this
before
will-
we act.
This will help the authorized committee see that whistleblower complaint.
Let me turn to our counterpart, your counterpart here, Mr. Winthrop, and get his thoughts on this.
Well, I would like to point out that the Senate put theirs together in a bipartisan fashion, as mentioned in there. This was not bipartisan. Can you tell me which Republicans were involved with this resolution?
Well, we drafted.
Were there any Republicans involved with this resolution?
We drafted the resolution, and my understanding is that the Senate Democrats drafted their resolution. It was proposed by Senator Schumer. The issue is not who did the drafting here. The issue is whether one party or both parties in the House are committed to validating the whistleblower protections and the whistleblower law. That's really what's at issue here. The resolution is pretty clear. Doesn't take a long time to read it, doesn't take a long
Took
time to
48
understand
hours
it.
to write it.
Basically, all it says is you should provide the complaint and you should stop attacking the whistleblower. That's pretty simple.
Well, we would have liked a little bit more notification than we got.
Well-
And, again, I understand the political pressure on your side on this incident seems to have exploded over the weekend. But I don't think waiting for a transcript, which is going to be forthcoming, and operating in a bipartisan way where you're including the minority members of your own committee is too much to ask on a matter of this gravity.
And I don't think it's too much to ask, Mr. Cole, that in a matter of this gravity, that you and others use your voice to validate the whistleblower process. And we
I'm
understand the
quite
pressure
prepared
that you're
and have
under from
used
the
my
White House.
voice in the past, but I usually wait until I know what's been said.
But you know, Mr. Cole, what the statute says, and you know the facts here that the director has not provided the complaint. We don't know what the facts are in the whistleblower complaint, but we do know the fact that it has not
We
been
don't
provided
know
to
a
Congress.
lot of the facts. That's exactly true. And there's evidently some debate even within the administration over this issue. Let me go to Mr. Winthrop and ask him for his response.
You know, I think it is prudent upon us to hear from the Director of National Intelligence as to why the decision thus far has been made. That is called prudence. Also, historically, based on actions from previous administration, I've tried to find the answer to a question, which is the intelligence community to stay out of conversations between two heads of state? And I'm basing that question on the previous administration and actions not taken, if you will. And I've gone as high up as I think I can, and the answer is, I've gotten so far, I don't know. So I think that it's prudent that we hear from the Director of National Intelligence in what is the standard in the intelligence community. Because I, sitting on the intelligence community, would like to know that. That's the importance of Thursday, in my opinion. So before we react, let's be cool. America's been around for a long time. We've been through a lot of things. let's go through some appropriate process, let all sides be heard as to why they made their decision from the position where they sit. That's all I'm asking. You've heard me agree with Mr. Schiff. The whistleblower process and the protection of whistleblowers is very important in our democracy. But let's do it right and not look like we're trying to stack the deck.
When was the meeting scheduled for the director to come and visit with the intelligence community?
When is he coming before the committee?
When was it scheduled? We know he's testifying Thursday. I gather it was scheduled some time ago,
Last week.
last week. So you knew he was coming this week at a date certain.
Yes, and we have remained in touch, and we've continued to demand that the whistleblower complaint be provided, and we have had no assurance from the director that that is forthcoming.
Again, if you wanted to move in a bipartisan fashion, I think, number one, you would have waited for that testimony. And number two, you would have at least communicated to the minority members on your own committee that you were proceeding this course. Evidently, in the Senate, they did. You know, as a House member, I'm disappointed we chose not to do that. And it will complicate your efforts to make it bipartisan.
Well, Ms. Cole,
enormously.
I'm disappointed that the Senate Republicans are willing to vote to insist that the law be followed, and it appears that many House Republicans
I
are
think
not
they
willing to
worked
do the same
in
thing.
concert with their minority. It's too bad you didn't choose to do the same thing, Mr. Chairman.
And it's too bad that House Republicans don't have the same commitment to the statute and to the whistleblower process.
Well, I don't think that's the case.
Well,
I think
we'll-
you just
we'll
heard,
find- we'll
I think
find
you
out-
just, I think
we'll-
you just
we'll find out
heard
when the
the
statute is
commitment
voted
to the
on.
whistleblower process by the minority's representative here.
Well, we'll find
Look,
out
we
whether
can go
you're-
on a long time, but this is like the political Pearl Harbor. You know, when you drop something this late, you don't do it in any consultation with the minority. You have scheduled testimony coming that may well have laid the groundwork for this. You've got a minority member saying you're perfectly right to protect the whistleblower process, and yet here we are. And that's because you just didn't include people up front.
Let's not pretend, Mr. Cole, that this is about process. This is about protecting the
No,
president.
it's not about process.
No, it isn't. It's
I would
about-
like to
it's
wait and
about
see what the
protecting-
entire conversation is
about
tomorrow, which I
protecting-
guess we'll hear.
It's about protecting the president,
No,
come hell or
it's
high
about a
water.
headlong rush to impeachment that we've watched unfold all Congress long. You know, and so that, to me, is what the process is about. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, you've
No,
been very
I
generous with the
appreciate-
time,
no, I appreciate
so I will yield back.
No, and let me just say for the record, you know, if people haven't read the bill, we're probably not going to vote on this until tomorrow. It's 7.5 pages long. I'm a slow reader, but I can probably get through it tonight. I already have, but, and I think it's pretty straightforward. So I yield to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Smith, for bringing this resolution forward. I strongly support you and all that you have endured while to uphold decency and to uphold justice in the American system. You know, for generations, America has stood as a beacon of democracy and justice. This is something that is admired worldwide. Everyone looks to us to uphold democracy. This president, every single day, challenges those basic values. Our Constitution is founded on those basic values. We have an urgent complaint that is a matter of national security. This is a political Pearl Harbor, as I see it. There were no bombs that were dropped, but our national elections were compromised before. And now we have a president of the United States of America sitting in the White House compromising our next elections. President Trump has used the threat of cutting off security assistance to bully Ukraine into investigating a campaign opponent, and then try to cover up a whistleblower complaint. A heroic person who filed a complaint about it That is a complete violation of our Constitution. And some of us in this room want to ignore that, as we have ignored previous complaints and previous concerns and previous wrongdoings over and over and over again. Because to some of us in this room, politics is more important than democracy, than the rule of law. The president on national television admitted to soliciting an investigation in exchange for foreign assistance, and that is wrong. The president's personal attorney admitted on national television that they have asked for this assistance. What more can we say? Let's move forward and proceed with an investigation. And thank you, Congressman Adam Schiff, for bringing this forward. And I
Thank you
yield
very
back.
much. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask questions of the witnesses, I'd like to ask my friend from California, which one of us in this room were you suggesting puts politics above the rule of law? Because I'm looking at colleagues all around this room, and I don't believe that about any one of them. And I would be interested to know if you do believe that about any one
Okay,
of them.
I did not call anyone by name, and I am not going to do that in this proceeding because that would be yielding to the political theater that you are bringing forward, and I'm not going to do that.
Well, I think the gentlelady makes my point. There's no one in this room I respect more than my friend from Florida, Mr. Hastings, and I know he was earnest when he asked the question about why folks are calling this political, when in fact it has been going on for a long time. And I don't want to mischaracterize my friend from Florida, but I believe he said the stonewalling of the Democrats' opportunity for oversight has been repeated over and over and over again. I know what he's feeling. I felt the same thing in the Obama administration. The Constitution didn't provide me with a Republican opportunity for oversight, nor does it provide my friend from Florida with a Democratic opportunity for oversight. It provides the United States Congress an Article I opportunity for oversight, and it pains me to see the two of you all on different sides of this issue. This isn't the Intelligence Committee I remember working up here on Capitol Hill in the 1990s. It just isn't. I don't know how you get it back. I'm glad I'm not tasked with returning it to that place. I know members of Congress who only stayed on Capitol Hill because of the honor and the privilege and the responsibility of serving on the Intelligence Committee and what they thought that meant to the United States people to have that bipartisan group doing that oversight work that has to be done. I don't want to put you on the spot, Dr. Wenstrup. I don't know the whistleblower process. Candidly, I haven't looked at it statutorily until we've had all of this conversation here over the last few days. But the resolution we have before us, and I think Chairman Schiff said, I would hope that we could support a bipartisan solution a resolution just as the Senate has. We don't have the same kind of resolution before us that the Senate had before it. The Senate resolution was very simple. It only had two whereases, and I don't have to guess. I can read from it. But is there something, Dr. Wenstrup, about the whistleblower process that to honor that process, Congress should not call on the complaint to be released? We do this kind of thing regularly. We call on the administration to give us information. Is there a protection in the whistleblower statute that says we shouldn't call on that to be disclosed? Or do we call for that complaint to be disclosed just like we would call for any other administration material to be disclosed?
And that is why I want to hear from the Director of National Intelligence, because I want to really establish what the rules are. I mean, let me explain to you why I'm confused on this. In an open hearing on intelligence, I asked former Director of the CIA, Mr. Brennan, about conversation between President Obama and President Medvedev. We won't go into it. It was caught on tape, but I just asked, I said, was that a red flag? And his comment back to me was, I'm not going to comment on a private conversation between two heads of state. So my question is that the law, that the intelligence community does not engage on conversations between two heads of state? Or is that just standard operating procedure, or is that just Mr. Brennan? And I haven't been able to get an answer. So this is a process thing, because quite frankly, maybe we need to consider changing the law if that is indeed the law. And that's why I want to hear what the Department of Justice related to the Director of National Intelligence. I don't think that's too much to ask. I think that's a process. All of us are learning about this process more and more because we're in it. Let's face it. I don't think anyone here is an expert on whistleblower process inside and out, nor does anyone seem to be an expert on whether what Mr. Brennan said to me is the law or just a standard operating procedure within the intelligence community. I don't know that answer. You know, I'm all about truth, justice, and the American way, and adhering to the laws and the rules that are in place. And I want to hear what exactly is the protocol. And I think this gives us the opportunity on Thursday. And if we don't like the protocol, it seems to me that we can change the protocol. And so that's where I'm sitting, and why I do want to get to the bottom of this and know that we're proceeding in accordance with all the rules, regulations, laws that may exist when it comes to a whistleblower complaint of this type in this actual scenario. Maybe Congress years ago felt it was in the best interest of the country for Congress to stay out of private conversations between two heads of state. That's the impression I got from Mr. Brennan. So I don't know. And that's why I want to have that conversation on Thursday. And I hope that answers your question.
Well, it takes a step there. I'm not tasked with the challenge that you all, right? There's so much here in Congress that only goes to the chairman of the Intelligence Committee and the ranking member. So much in this Congress that only happens in your committee. The other members of Congress are not involved. We recognize the special place that you all have. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know those whistleblower statutes, and I look forward to having some of my colleagues educate me on that. I'd be inclined to support the resolution that the Senate passed, which said very simply, the whistleblower complaint received shall be transmitted immediately to the Select Committee and the Permanent Select Committee, and the Senate and the Select Committee and the Permanent Select Committee should be allowed to evaluate the complaint in a deliberate and bipartisan manner consistent with all the statutes designed to safeguard classified and sensitive information. That seems very reasonable to me, because we make a practice constitutionally of turning materials over to you all that the rest of us don't see, things that are kept out of the political sphere, that are kept in the intelligence sphere. Why didn't we? I listened to your opening statement. You talked a lot about you wished we would behave as the Senate would. Why didn't we just draft the exact same word-for-word resolution that the Senate drafted? Even do it as a joint resolution if folks had wanted to, and moved it forward?
Well, I would say this. First of all, we didn't know that the Senate was going to be able to take this up on UC until we got notice that they had already. We didn't draft this jointly, and it was our early sense that it wasn't going to be agreed to by the Republicans in the Senate. So we drafted our resolution, the Senate drafted his. Now, they ended up approving it on UC, and I don't know what happened behind the scenes to make that happen. I suspect it's that Republicans in the Senate felt that the language of the statute says the director shall transmit that complaint to Congress within 7 days, and they thought shall meant shall. And I don't think there's anything that, in terms of what this House resolution joins them to do, that's different in character than what the Senate resolution does. So I would take a look at the 7.5 pages and see if you think it does.
Well, it's an unfortunate statement about where we are in the political process these days. This statement calls out the President of the United States by name, characterizes his behavior in shaming folks and intimidating folks. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong about that, but there is, if you cannot tell the difference as the Chief Intelligence Officer of the United States House of Representatives between saying, please adhere to your statutory deadlines, and I'm going to call you out by name and characterize your behaviors as being inappropriate. There just is not a small difference, but a dramatic difference in those two things. And asking, failing to see that difference troubles me. And that's why I ask if you considered the Senate resolution. I understand the timeline that you've laid out.
Let me just say, though, is it too much to ask that the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, urge the president not to suggest the whistleblower is a traitor to his country? And the president said that he wondered which country this whistleblower, which side the whistleblower was on. Is it too much to ask on a bipartisan basis that we ask the President of the United States not to be attacking a whistleblower that presumably he doesn't know who that whistleblower is, presumably doesn't know whether that whistleblower is deserving of these attacks? I would hope that we could find agreement on that.
Fair enough. And if your opening statement had been, shame on the United States Senate for not having the courage to do that, I would hope they would have had the courage to do that. And why didn't Chuck Schumer stand up and say exactly those things? Then that would be a fair statement. But that wasn't what your opening statement was. Your opening statement was, I really wish we could do this in a bipartisan way. The Senate did do it in a bipartisan way, not by calling people out by names, not by characterizing behavior, but to say we've got a serious statutory responsibility here. We've got a serious oversight responsibility here, and we've picked the very finest members of the House and Senate to serve on the intelligence committees. We can trust them with this information in closed session. I find that compelling. Maybe some of my other colleagues don't. I find that case that Schumer made compelling, and because I think we missed so many opportunities to work together here. I was just, again, curious what that reason was, and you have explained it to me in the timeline, and I'm grateful to you for that. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter.
Oh, could I say one
more thing.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Pardon me. And it relates to what my friend from Florida said, and I would instinct the same offer to the rest of you. I think that's outrageous that you've written to cabinet officials and not gotten responses from them on that. And if there's ever anything that I can put my name on that same letter with you and then stand with you to demand that answer, again, there's so many things. It's not us Republicans against them, the Democrats. It's us, Article 1, against Article 2 to do what the American people asked us to do. And I'm sorry that's happening to you, and I would love to be your partner, any of your partners, in demanding better service that this House of Representatives deserves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I guess I'd say to my friend, Mr. Woodall, there is no discretion in the statute. And I'd ask my friend to look at 103H K5C, because he's a good attorney, and you take a look at it, and it just says, shall within 7 calendar days of receipt forward such transmittal to the Congressional Intelligence Committees, together with any comments the director considers appropriate. Period. There is no, hey, you can hold it up. No, you've got to transfer it. That's the statute. Period. And I guess just, Mr. Wenstrup is a friend of mine. You're a friend of mine. Everybody, I just got to say that this is one thing after another. We wrote a letter on the Financial Services Committee in the spring of 2017 asking for information about Deutsche Bank and what we thought might be bank records that showed some kind of funneling of money from Russia to Deutsche Bank to who knows where. Nothing, zero, got nothing. When we the Democrats took the majority, we again propounded these requests. Nothing, zero. So then we subpoena, still nothing. We go to court. The United States District Court says, give them the bank records. Appealed in the Second Circuit. The Second Circuit says, not only we're interested in these bank records, but what about the tax returns? This is now 2.5 years later. And I would say to my friend from Ohio that if this were just one thing, if it wasn't one thing after another and withholding information, just basic bank records or tax returns, and here there's a specific statute on whistleblower, which you agree with, because your committee is actually a very special committee. You guys do meet in secret. None of us know really what the heck goes on in your committee. And here, you're going to get a complaint, which you're going to get in secret, and you don't even get it. He doesn't follow the statute. He has no discretion here. None. He's just the messenger. He gets it, and he's got to give it to you. That's the law. And I've been where Mr. Hastings been. Just let's try to get going here. And Mr. Cole, I want us to work on health care. I want us to work on infrastructure. I want us to work on a whole array of things. But I can tell you, blocking something where the statute gives no discretion to the DNI or anybody else to hold it back from you all, because I trust both of you to look at it with very discerning eyes. And we've given you a special privilege in this House of Representatives to be on that committee. And I appreciate your position that you support the whistleblower. Well, that statute says not only should you support the whistleblower bringing information to your committee, it's got to be done within a very quick time frame, because the stuff your committee deals with is life or death right now. So I support this resolution. I can't see how it is anything other than the law under the statute, and I yield back.
Dr. Berger?
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. Mr. Wenstrup, let me just ask you, some of the, and obviously a lot of information has come at us very quickly today, but some of the information that I've seen in the news wires revolves around the issue of urgent. And was this an urgent request that was referred? And was the acting director of national intelligence required to act under that verbiage that it was urgent? My understanding is that there was a disagreement, and so it's been referred to the Department of Justice to determine the degree of whether it's urgent or not. Is that, am I understanding correctly from what the news reports have been?
Well, that's what I'd like to find out on Thursday. And you know as a doctor, and I know as a doctor, urgent can mean a lot of different things. And I don't have a very clear definition of that necessarily, and I don't know that that's necessarily well defined. But I am curious. I am curious as to what is the case to be made for not turning it over immediately. And that's why we want to have the Director of National Intelligence come in on Thursday. She's agreed to do. I don't know who set up the date. Maybe it could have been done within 7 days. I don't know. We don't control that. Maybe it's a matter of scheduling. But I think it needs to be heard. As I said earlier, I have questions as to whether there may be some other law or statute somewhere that says that the intelligence community cannot engage in conversations between two heads of state, because I've been given that answer by Director Brennan. So I think Thursday is very important. Those are the questions I would ask, which I have not gotten an answer to when I have sought it from other areas as well, from other supposed experts. So urgent can mean different things. I think this is some clarity that we need to put to rest on Thursday, hopefully. And I'm glad that the director has not said, I'm not coming in.
Right.
But I am coming in to discuss it.
And, Mr. Chairman, just so I'm clear, we'll have this rule on the floor tomorrow?
I'm not certain, Dr. Burgess. I'll wait for Mr. McGovern to get back to tell you where it is.
And the resolution, would it follow the same day?
My thinking is that it will. I would think we will be able to, once this is reported out, I believe that we will have an adequate rule.
Well, we got the Director of National Intelligence coming to testify to your committee. Those of us up here will not be necessarily privy, other than what comes out in leaks, and that may be substantial, but nevertheless, we won't be privy to that information. But still, it seems like it would be prudent for that to occur before this resolution is brought to the floor of the House. Now, I also heard at some point this afternoon, the president is planning on making a transcript of the telephone call in question, making that public. And that might occur as early as tomorrow. Did I understand that correctly?
That's what I understand. And, let me go back to something I said at the very beginning. Based on facts in hand, we still don't know what the whistleblower complaint says.
So we're going to be voting on this resolution and we don't know what the complaint is?
No one has seen it factually. You've had news stories. That is the point. I would agree, Mr. Brown. That is the point. And it's also the point that we haven't heard from the Director of National Intelligence. And I think if someone in that position that's making a decision, a public decision, should have the opportunity to explain their decision, we may all override that person. That's our role as oversight, but I think it deserves to be heard from our Department of Justice and from the Director of National Intelligence, if indeed the Director was instructed by Department of Justice.
And then finally, let me just ask, where in this sequence of events is your committee going to, is your committee going to have an opportunity to interview the whistleblower?
Mr. Schiff?
Well, that's the second problem, which is the statute not only requires the director to forward the complaint to us within 7 days, the statute requires the director to give instructions through the IG to the whistleblower about how they can come directly to the Congress. The whistleblower today indicated through his attorney or her attorney that they want to come and talk to our committee. But they can't as yet get the instructions from the director about how to do that. The director is withholding that. And for the whistleblower's point of view, they have to be concerned that if they don't follow the statute, they're not protected. They could be fired, they could lose their security clearance. And so here you have the director not only withholding the complaint, but withholding even telling the whistleblower how to come to our committee. Now, in terms of the timing of the director's testimony, we wanted the director to come in last week. The director asked for a delay, and we gave him a delay in the hope that we'd get the complaint before he ever came to our committee. But the days are going on, and one thing that was really underscored by the Inspector General is that this is urgent, and not just in a statutory way, it's urgent as we understand that term. And so we cannot afford the situation that we've had with the other committees where the administration can play rope-a-dope in the courts for weeks and months. There's a fire, we need to put it out, or years. And so we don't know what the subject of the complaint is. I mean, there's obviously a lot of press reporting and speculation even here in the committee about it involving presidential communication, but this isn't about whether it involves a presidential communication or not. We know enough facts to act already. We know what the law says. We know that the fact that that law hasn't been followed, and in fact, we didn't find out about this because the director came to us and said, I'm required to provide this complaint to you, but I'm not going to do it for such and such reason. No, we found out because the Inspector General came to us to say, the director is not following the statute, and you need to know that this is happening. In that sense, the Inspector General was kind of a whistleblower. So those facts are uncontested. We don't have to debate about whether, in fact, the president did this or that, or what effect the transcript has. Whatever's in the transcript isn't going to obviate the need to hear from the whistleblower. And the question is whether the message to the director and the administration is going to be uniform from both House and Senate, that the law needs to be followed. And I would hope that it will be uniform.
So, Dr. Winthrop, you look like you wanted to say something.
And this is what's still up in the air. So I don't doubt the Inspector General's abilities, capabilities, or conclusions that he felt this is of urgent concern. The Director of National Intelligence may disagree with that and may say this doesn't fit the criteria as they see it. That's what I want to hear. That's what I want to know and be able, and you tell me, why it's not urgent if you think it's not urgent. And I just think, again, this resolution gets out ahead of ourselves when we have the opportunity to conduct ourselves very professionally and go through a process. And that's my state right now. Like I said, we don't even know who the whistleblower is. That's fine. That's how whistleblowers should be protected. But we don't know what the complaint is. You know, I was part of a whistleblower investigation with DOD, and, you know, we were able to talk to the whistleblower and also go through the process as was appropriate within the military and intelligence community. I just want to make sure we're crossing all our T's and dotting all our I's. I don't think it's too much to ask, but that's okay. You know, push this out on the floor tomorrow. We'll talk to him on Thursday, but I think it's a shame we're going in that direction, and not in a bipartisan fashion of trying to gather all the facts as best we can.
And Dr. Winstrup, can I just ask, when did you first see this resolution?
About 2 hours ago at this point.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'll yield back.
Let me underscore a point that Mr. Schiff made, and that is regardless of this potential to receive the transcript tomorrow from the administration, that's a transcript of the conversation between the president and the president of Ukraine. I gather that that's what it is. But this is about the complaint. And I think what you all will find is that the complaint itself is what all of us ought to want to see to make our own judgments as to whether or not the Inspector General acted accordingly. Experience teaches that he wouldn't have said the words urgent if he didn't think that it was, and whether the DNI agrees or not. Where I find discomfort is the fact that the Justice Department is called on, and we almost know where they were going to come down, at least in my judgment, and I'm speaking only for myself and not for anybody else. But the fact of the matter is, this resolution is about getting the complaint. And I believe if we do push it out tomorrow, that when the DNI does testify, it will give him greater reason to want to release that complaint. That's my view. Mr. Raskin?
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and thank you for your very thoughtful remarks before. They were edifying for the committee. Mr. Schiff, welcome, and thank you for your extremely hard work during this tough period. You know, this statute is unfamiliar to most members of Congress, unfamiliar to most Americans, and it's a mysterious foreign world to most of us, the whole intelligence operation. So I just wonder if you would take me through it slowly so we can see exactly what the legal obligations are. And I'm just going to try to restate it to my own understanding and interrupt me when I'm not getting it right or you feel like we need to elaborate something, okay? So there's a statute that was adopted by Congress to protect whistleblowers in the intelligence community. And it gives them the opportunity to go to the Inspector General. The Inspector General then decides whether it is a credible report of a problem, and the Inspector General can determine whether there's an urgency to the problem. This problem can be a form of abuse of the law, it can be a crisis, it can be impropriety, it could be crime, it could be a whole number of different things. At that point, the Inspector General essentially rules on it and says whether it's credible and whether this is of an urgent nature. And then at that point, if the IG finds that, it is turned over to the Director of National Intelligence. And upon receipt, the Director of National Intelligence has 7 days within which to turn it over to your committee. How am I doing?
You're doing very well.
Okay, so all of that happened in this case. That is, there was a whistleblower who made a complaint about the President of the United States, thought it was urgent. The IG looked at it and said, this is credible and this is urgent. He turned it over to the Director of National Intelligence, who received it, but then 7 days came and went, and he refused to bring it to the House Committee on Intelligence. Is that right?
Yes, I think technically he authorizes the IG to provide it to the committee, so it's transmitted to us through the IG's office.
Okay, but he refused to authorize
Correct.
the transmission of it to Congress from the IG. Okay, so has this ever happened before?
It's never happened before.
In other words, have there been complaints before, or is this the first time?
There have been dozens of complaints before. This is the first complaint since the creation of the whistleblower statute and the creation of the Office of Director of National Intelligence that a complaint has ever been withheld from Congress for any reason.
Okay.
And I should say, and this is an important point, two things. One is the DNI has written to us to give his explanation for why he won't provide it. The DNI does not take issue with the urgency. The DNI essentially takes the position that after the Department of Justice weighing in, and maybe others, they would not answer the question about whether the White House has been weighing in with them, that they believe this is outside of the DNI's jurisdiction. Now, the Inspector General said in response, no, this is central to the DNI's jurisdiction. So there's no dispute about the urgency here.
So they don't dispute the authenticity or the credibility, and they don't dispute the urgency, they just say it's somehow outside the scope of the statute.
Yes, now it may be, if the public reports are correct, that they're taking the position that because the president is above the IG, that above the DNI, that it's not within the jurisdiction of the DNI because he's above the DNI. But if that were true, then it means the president is above anyone's jurisdiction. And you know, the other point I would make, Mr. Raskin, is the entire history of this whistleblower complaint process has been such that even when the Inspector General, in their investigation, determines that a complaint is not urgent or doesn't meet the criteria for whatever reason, that complaint has still been provided to the committee. And the whistleblower has still been given instructions how they can come directly to the committee because the statute presupposes that the Congress may take a different view of it. And so the entire history and practice has been, whatever the findings are, the complaint goes to Congress because the whole point of the process is to give the whistleblower an avenue to come to Congress.
And so it goes to the representatives of the people, and in congressional wisdom, we've created a committee of experts to review this, and you're able to assess things for credibility, authenticity, urgency, the character of the complaint. Right?
Yes.
Okay. Is it true that the president called the whistleblower a traitor?
I believe the president said that I'm paraphrasing here, whose country is this whistleblower really on the side of? Which is an accusation along the lines of maybe this person is a
Are you aware that the president has brought any evidence forward either to your committee or to law enforcement about the whistleblower being an agent of a foreign government?
I'm not aware of anything like that. And you know, if I could also say, in terms of the president's comments on this, which I find also disturbing, he's been saying that everybody has seen the complaint. Now, the Congress hasn't seen the complaint. The intended recipient of the complaint has not seen the complaint. If the president is the subject of the complaint, and again, we don't know, the idea that people around the president's own lawyers, may have seen the complaint and are using that in the same way, frankly, that the president's handpicked lawyers misrepresented the Mueller report. Now they're misrepresenting the complaint. There's a wholly other order of magnitude of problem going on.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Wenstrup, I have two questions for you. One is, you suggested that the director disagrees with the Inspector General's interpretation of the complaint, but what's the part of the statute that authorizes the Director of National Intelligence to use his disagreement with the Inspector General not to turn over the complaint within 7 days?
That's what I hope to find out Thursday.
Well, no, but what in the statute? I mean, we've got a copy of the statute here.
That's what I would like to find out Thursday, and maybe it's in another statute on which I'm not familiar. I don't know.
Okay.
And that's fair. There may be,
Okay.
I mean,
Look,
I brought up the point before.
Yeah.
Is it the standard that the intelligence community is not engaged between conversations between two heads of
Okay,
state?
so let me ask you about that. You piqued my curiosity with that point. Now, say this again. The question, and again, this world is unfamiliar to me. We don't have the benefit of being on the committee that you guys do. But you're saying if there's a conversation between two chiefs, two chiefs of government, two heads of state, that the statute has a silent exception that does not permit.
That's my question.
Okay, but the question you're asking is whether there is a silent or implied exception in the statute for someone who wants to report an emergency situation.
I've asked that question of someone who should know the answer, and I got no answer.
Yeah.
And when I did ask in a similar fashion.
Well, has this been asserted by the Director of National Intelligence that there's an exception for conversations between heads of state?
That's what I want to find out.
Well, where's the question coming from? I guess that's my issue. They didn't come back and say, it's day 7, we understand every other director of national intelligence has turned the complaint over to you. We're not going to do it because we read in invisible ink a provision in the statute to say if there's a conversation between 2 heads of state, we're not covered by it. I mean, where is it coming from?
Well, I'm glad you have the same question I do. Thank you.
Well, I actually don't have that question because I don't see it. I'm a mere lawyer. I read the statute. I don't see anything about that in there. So, I mean,
then-
it's a creative suggestion, but I think it's an
then,
irrelevant
Mr. Raskin-
distraction from interpretation
Mr.
of the
Raskin,
statute.
then I should have
yeah.
been able to get an answer from someone who sits in the position to be able to determine that. And I got no answer. And when I did ask Director Brennan one time about a conversation between 2 heads of state, his only answer to me was, I'm not going to comment, I'm paraphrasing, and I can get the actual context, between a conversation between 2 heads of state. So here's someone, Central Intelligence Agency, who's not going to comment on a private conversation between 2 heads of state. Don't you have the same curiosity I have?
Oh, but I'm very curious about it. I just don't know if it's relevant to the issue at hand. And I can
It may be totally
appreciate
relevant.
your frustration about the situation because this is a democracy. We govern, the Congress passes laws for everybody and everything, including intelligence. And the law is written for all of us. And this law seems to be very clear. Right, I'm a strict textualist and originalist. This law says in 7 days, the Director of Intelligence, whether he loves the complaint, he hates the complaint, he rolls his eyes at the complaint, whatever it is, he turns it over to Congress. To you guys, it's about your authority. It's about our authority as the representatives of Congress. So I thank you guys for educating me on how the statute works, but I feel ever more determined that we've got to pass this resolution, and I too am glad that the Senate acted in a bipartisan way, and I hope if you guys have any changes you want to it, you suggest them so we can pass it in a bipartisan way in Congress. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to continue what Mr. Woodard had talked about, and that is the difference between the 2 resolutions, the Senate resolution and this House resolution. And I read the Senate resolution. It's very simple. It basically says, it asks the whistleblower complaint be transmitted to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, and that the committees should be allowed to evaluate the complaint. That's it. Very simple. I think it's like 1 page. This resolution, however, has several places with disparaging language, and I can read it out loud if you'd like. It says, whereas allegations of such unprecedented and highly inappropriate efforts by President Trump and the White House and other senior officials of the Trump administration too, and then it goes on to say all the terrible things that have been done. And so I guess I'm going to ask a question of Mr. Winstrup. Earlier today in this hearing, Mr. Schiff, Chairman Schiff, said something to the effect, I didn't write it down, but something to the effect of if the House Republicans don't agree with this resolution like the Senate Republicans agreed with the resolution, then the House Republicans must just not care enough about, uncovering this complaint and having transparency. And in light of the fact that if we don't, there are 2 different stark differences. The Senate resolution was very simple. Just said turn over the complaint and we'll evaluate it. This one goes on about disparaging different people. So in your opinion, is Mr. Schiff accurate in his statement when he said that about House Republicans?
Well, we do care, and that's why I'm here. And we care very significantly, and I don't think it's fair for anyone to try and cast aspersions on an entire party because you have a difference of opinion. And I agree with what you just said. If you really want to get to this, you could have done it in a way that just gets to the heart of the matter like the Senate did. And I think it's a good point to be made. And it's a shame that it's come forward like this. Again, who knows? After Thursday, we could maybe agree to have the same resolution the Senate has. But I think it's important for us to have that conversation with the Director of National Intelligence, as we have with the IG, And as I said in my statement, I can't imagine that it would just be okay if we only heard from the DNI and not the IG and ended there. I don't think, and I can't answer for Mr. Schiff, but I don't think that would have been adequate. I think it would be important that we hear from both parties involved with this so we can make intelligent decisions as we move forward in our role of oversight over this process.
Thank you. And, to my fellow members, I just want to say, because several times you've said, all we want to get to is finding out about this complaint. Well, if that's all that you want to get to and you don't want to make a political statement, which you said this is not political, which I disagree with, then why all the disparaging language? Why all the attacks? Why don't you just make it simple like the Senate one and say, we want the information to go to the intelligence committees? And so really, if you really look at this and think about it, I hope that you'll realize this is political.
Chairman, may I respond?
Yes.
We're getting two different messages from my colleagues today. One from my colleague from the committee, who I presume is representing the ranking member here today. One from the ranking member of this committee, which is this resolution, indeed any resolution, is premature. We shouldn't have to take this up before the director comes in. So this isn't really about, oh, we like the Senate language better than the House language. No one on this committee, Democrat, Republican, has pointed anything in the House resolution that isn't true. Those comments you think are disparaging of the president are his words. Now, maybe you don't want to acknowledge his words, but I do think that it's important that if we're going to validate the whistleblower process, that we not stand silent when the president is attacking someone who is following the law and doing exactly what we would hope they would, which is show the courage to come forward. So I don't know what your message is here today. Is it, this is premature, there shouldn't be any, we disagree with the Senate in moving so quickly? Or is it, well, we would support this if you'd just written it differently? Because I'm hearing two very different things here. I suspect that the discomfort you're expressing with the language is really to mask the fact that you don't want this resolution, you don't want any resolution. And this is an effort to try to explain why your senators voted for this, but you're not. And if I'm wrong about that, then maybe I'm misinterpreting Dr. Wenstrup and Mr. Cole's comments, because it sounded to me like they thought that any resolution on this subject was premature.
Ms. Lesko?
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, yes, I do disagree with you, Mr. Schiff, on what Republicans think, and maybe Republicans can have two thoughts at the same time. But I want to clarify for the record, because you just said these were President Trump's own words and they're not disparaging. I mean, I doubt very highly, I know it's not true, that President Trump would say this. It says, whereas allegations of such unprecedented and highly inappropriate efforts by President Donald J. Trump and White House and other senior officials, President Trump did not say that. So I want to clear that for the record. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
I would only add,
I'm having trouble understanding what this is the particular paragraph on page 6 where it says, whereas allegations of such unprecedented and highly inappropriate efforts by President Donald Trump and White House and other senior officials of the Trump, you saying that President Trump didn't say that. They're not saying that President Trump said that. What they are saying in the paragraph above that, I heard with my own ears that the president called the whistleblower a political hack job and a partisan person. And I don't think that it's disparaging to call out what the president has said himself. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you. I wanted to thank Chairman Schiff for pointing out that so many of the objections being raised here today have to do with process and that we should wait and see some undefined time longer. As a member of House Judiciary for the past few months, I've become overly familiar with this administration's obstruction of criminal and congressional investigations using delay, diversion, and denial of the rule of law. We're now confronting a fresh, urgent, and credible threat to our national security, our elections, and our Constitution. So to paraphrase the great Barbara Jordan, I didn't come to D.C. to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of our Constitution. So I support this resolution and I yield back.
Mr. Morelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Mr. Schiff and the ranking member. I'm not an attorney and I'm not a national security expert, so I'm just trying to sort of understand this from the perspective of the people back home that I represent. Could you, Mr. Chair, walk me through why the Whistleblower Act was set up in the first place in the late 1900s?
Well, there are a number of whistleblower laws that pertain to different departments and agencies.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I should have been more explicit, related to the intelligence community, this particular section.
By comparison, I think the whistleblower laws pertaining to the IC are a more recent vintage, but they're still a couple decades old, and they were a recognition that the intelligence community employees and detailees are in a unique position in that they have access to classified information and they don't have other avenues to seek redress of wrongdoing. They can't go to the press without violating the law if it deals with classified information. So there needed to be a mechanism to be able to come to Congress. And the mechanism that Congress created was one in which the whistleblower goes not directly to Congress, but through the Inspector General to Congress. That they file a complaint, and the Inspector General can review that complaint and do a preliminary analysis, and they have 2 weeks to do it. And then that complaint is referred by the IG to the DNI, and they have 1 week to review it, and then they shall transmit it to Congress. Now, they can include whatever comments they want. I believe it, I don't believe it, whatever, but they transmit it.
And so, thank you for that. The Inspector General, I gather, and please correct me, is put in place as, well, maybe not a neutral arbiter, but someone who is, I assume, expected to take the information and determine whether or not there's, I think the term is credible, credible evidence that the whistleblower's complaint has validity to it. And that the reason they exist is for that neutral observation and be is that right?
Yes, the Inspector General, although appointed by President Trump, is a neutral party. They do their own independent legal analysis and factual analysis. They only have a couple weeks to do it, so they have to do it quickly. And after having done that, they found it both credible and urgent and meeting all the statutory requirements.
And the reason the Inspector General is there rather than the whistleblower taking it directly to the DNI is because the DNI could be complicit in this or at least is an interested party. Is that correct?
I think that the reason why the language of the statute is mandatory, not permissive, the DNI shall transmit it, is if a
Well, let me, before I get to that, because that is important as well, the reason that the IG is the person who determines credible evidence and transmits to the Congress instead of the DNI, that extra step, is that because the DNI may be complicit in whatever the whistleblower is trying to communicate to the Congress?
Well, whether complicit or not complicit.
Or interested?
Is interested, because it's a matter within the authority and jurisdiction of the director. And so if it reflects poorly on the agency, reflects wrongdoing on behalf of the agency, you don't want to give the agency head the unilateral discretion, or really any discretion, to withhold that information from Congress.
And that's why, to the next point I think you were making, why the DNI has the opportunity to review the credible complaint and add whatever additional commentary he or she thinks is appropriate as it's being transmitted. But the question of whether or not it's being transmitted in the first place is not in question. That is not under the discretion of, at that point, anyone. Is that right?
That's correct.
So may I ask, I didn't see anywhere here, but is there an exemption for the President of the United States under the whistleblower law?
No, there's not.
So to Mr. Raskin's point earlier, there is apparently a theory being perhaps proffered by the White House that the President sits on top of the DNI and therefore would not be subject to it. But it occurs to me the drafters of this section would certainly have anticipated that the President, him or herself, could have been the subject of the whistleblower's complaint. Is that not reasonable to expect?
Certainly. you would not want to foreclose a whistleblower from reporting misconduct if that misconduct came from the highest source in the land.
And it seems to me, again, this is just my conjecture, but that as you're going through this and as the authors of this statute were considering it, it's hard to imagine anyone who has a greater impact on national intelligence than the president himself.
That's right.
So it would be hard to imagine that they conceived of a statute and didn't put an explicit exemption to the law that involved the president, since the president would typically be the one who would have the greatest impact in the first place.
Yes, and I might add, too, that the subject of the complaint does not need to be within the jurisdiction of the director in the sense of being an employee of the director. The one filing the complaint has to be, but the subject does not have to be. As long as the subject is an issue within the jurisdiction of the director, and national security is very much within the discretion of the director, and the Inspector General made it clear to our committee in writing that this was not only, the subject matter was not only within the jurisdiction of the DNI, but it was something that the American people would fully expect was essentially central to his responsibilities.
Is there anywhere in the statute where it indicates that the Director of National Intelligence can appear before the Intelligence Committee, and that would obviate the need for the Inspector General's report to be forwarded to the Intelligence Committees?
No.
So I do want, I recognize concerns raised by my colleagues about how much time they've had to look at what is just a couple of pages, but aside from what I learned a long time ago is the whereases are interesting, but the operative provisions of any resolution are the resolved. And the resolve, just as so I understand what we're doing, first of all, that the acting director immediately remedy the violation of the National Security Act as it relates to the whistleblower section by forwarding the complaint, which he is compelled under the law to do, the accompanying materials, and the determination that the Inspector General made that the complaint was a credible, urgent concern, and any comments that the acting director, which is under the statute, considers appropriate. So that's number one. Is that correct?
Yes.
Number two, provide the whistleblower through the Inspector General any necessary direction as to how to contact the appropriate Congressional Intelligence Committees directly and accordingly in accordance with appropriate security practice. That's that's part B of the first section that's resolved. It says also the acting director must comply fully with the subpoena, that they must immediately take affirmative public steps to ensure the whistleblower and any other person with knowledge be fully protected from reprisals, which is the very reason we have the whistleblower statute in place. Number four, that the director, the Department of Justice, and the White House must preserve all records and documentation, seems appropriate given that it's a credible complaint. And finally, that the president, his associates, and other senior officials cease their efforts to discredit the whistleblower as they have done publicly. That's the total sum and substance of this resolution.
That's right.
So I struggle to understand why we would wait for Thursday to come for the director to be able to try to somehow persuade us that the law, which is pretty well spelled out, should not be followed. There's no provision for that in statute at all. In fact, in my mind, it undermines the whole point of having the whistleblower statute in the first place, does it not?
I don't know that it undermines it, but it's certainly not an excuse for not providing the complaint.
Well, I guess from my perspective, it undermines it if the DNI disagrees with the whistleblower or disagrees with the Inspector General's conclusion that it's credible and chooses instead to say, well, I'll come to Congress and tell you why I don't think it's a particularly good idea without respect to whatever the Inspector General said. It would seem to me if Congress took that view, it does undermine the statute because it then takes away the independent view of the Inspector General that this was a credible complaint to start with.
Yes, and we made it clear in the letter to the DNI that while we fully expected him to appear and testify, this was no substitute or in no way mitigated the statutory requirement that he turn over that complaint now.
And I appreciate, I served in the state legislature, we would often talk about shall and may. This is not it's not something to be blurred. This is a pretty simple concept. it's frankly a binary thing when it comes to shall. You either are required to do it or you're not, and you're required to do it under the statute. So I'm not sure what the questions are here, and I think this is obviously a very, very difficult situation for our country. I think it was without precedent, but it is exactly these types of situation that I think the statute is intended to provide guidance and information to the Congress about, to maintain our duties and responsibilities, and so we can fully comply with those duties and responsibilities. And I don't know if there's anything.
Well, my friend
Yes,
from New
sir.
York, Yield, I appreciate your thoughtful comments. The only distinction I would make is that if there's a violation of the whistleblower statute today, the U.S. House of Representatives passing a non-binding resolution will not have any effect on the shall. That to the degree that there's a legal question here, our non-binding resolution does nothing to provide clarity to that.
You know, I would.
And we should not err in giving the administration, giving Article 2 another excuse to ignore Article 1 as a non-binding resolution does. I appreciate my friend yielding.
No, I appreciate that. And look, I have enormous respect for you, Mr. Woodall, and I enjoy our conversations immensely. I think had there been calls from both sides of Congress that the Inspector General's report be furnished to the intelligence committees without delay in accordance with the statute, instead of this notion that somehow there may be some unwritten exemption to the law which doesn't compel that report to come forward, I would be less concerned that we need to do this, and whether this is binding or not. I mean, frankly, the law is not the law is not non-binding. The law is binding, and yet the DNI has refused to comply with it. So this is adding just one more voice and one more point of pressure to force the compliance with the statute. So it certainly doesn't harm anything. I mean, the law is what the law is, and that's being ignored. So if your argument is that another non-binding resolution is simply going to be ignored, well, I'm not sure where that leaves us all.
Well, if my friend would yield,
Yeah.
non-binding resolutions are by definition ignored, right? They're not binding, it's just information, and I believe the White House already knows the Democratic leadership wants this information. What I was saying disadvantaged us as Article 1 is that if we passed, as the Senate did, a very strong bipartisan bill, then we have a different conversation with Article 2. We're not going to impact the law. The law, the legal distinctions are going to be litigated elsewhere. What you and I have is an Article 1, Article 2 concern, and as I said earlier, I think Mr. Winstrup, as an intelligence official, has an obligation to hear from the DNI. I'm not bound by that. I'm not going to hear from the DNI on Thursday, and nobody's going to tell me about that. I'm prepared to vote with you today to have this shared with the House.
But I don't think, I hate to interrupt you, but I haven't heard anything that in any way suggests that these are mutually exclusive. You must comply with the law. To the extent that the DNI comes in to brief the intelligence community, I don't see that there's anything mutually exclusive. What is compelled is that the whistleblower report, given the green light to be credible by the Inspector General, must come to the Intelligence Committee. That's not in dispute. If the DNI wants to come and give his recollection or of his opinion, I certainly don't object to that, but that's not mandated. What is mandated is a report from the Inspector General to go to the members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and with all due respect, the Senate resolution is non-binding as well. Somehow you seem to favor it, but it's a non-binding resolution, all for us to be able to communicate effectively to the White House, to the intelligence apparatus, that this is a required step in our process, and so I don't know that the Senate resolution in front of us would have any more weight. Hopefully, people will be compelled to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, but more importantly, because it is the law of the land. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. You're good. And is Ms. Shalala, has she? She's not coming. Oh, she is coming back? Oh, she just went downstairs to vote. Well, but let me take one moment then to pursue a point that our friend Mr. Woodall made. You said that the administration knows that the Democrats are interested in this information. shouldn't the administration be aware that Congress wants the information? I mean, really, and maybe this is perhaps better posed to our witnesses, but don't both sides think that it's important for us to receive this information? Mr. Schiff?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
and I'm going to need to run and vote too, I would just suggest to my colleague that if this is really an issue about the verbiage, then please make your suggestions to the chairman of the Rules Committee about that. I think it's important that we speak with one voice in both houses about how much we respect and depend upon the whistleblower protections. And if you have suggestions on content, we welcome them. But if this is just about trying to put this off, we're not interested. But if this is about, well, I kind of agree with what you're asking, I just don't agree with how you're asking for it, then that gives us something to work with.
And if I could just add to that and maybe come to you, Mr. Woodall, I'm somebody who happens to believe in non-binding resolutions, but I mean, I believe in poetry too and literature. So, is it not the case that if we had unanimous, bipartisan, non-binding resolution support in Congress, that would look very different to the administration than if it's divided? And so, what about Mr. Schiff's suggestion? Maybe we could tailor the language in a different way that would appeal to you.
Well, to Mr. Winstrup's point, the Senate did work this through in a bipartisan way. I don't know what the Intelligence Committee can agree to, because, again, I don't understand the magnitude of their job. I know what I can agree to. There's nothing that happens in the administration outside of something covered by executive privilege that I don't have the right to see as a United States congressman, particularly when I'm going to turn it over to our super secret subsection of the United States Congress. So I don't care who doesn't want to turn over what to whom. I've got a right to demand it as Article 1. What non-binding resolutions are diminished further, though, when they come out 218 to 217.
So what about that, Mr. Winstrup? I mean, is it, as the chairman suggests, is it possible that we could actually agree on something that looks more like the Senate language?
Well, I'm in no position to answer for the whole committee, to be honest with you. I think that I would be personally more comfortable if I understood the complete intent of the statute. Why is the DNI in the statute? There must be some reason. Or why doesn't the statute say that, you know, regardless of what the DNI thinks, it goes to Congress? This is why I want to have that conversation Thursday, because I think if there's ambiguity in this, different from the intent of it, then we need to clear that up.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, and finally, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala, is recognized for her
Thank you very much. I actually am interested in that subject because the Inspector General's law, when it was written to give direct access to the IGs to the Congress without going through their agency heads. In this case, it looks to me like this law was particularly written in a way in which the IG had to give the Director of National Intelligence a certain amount of time to review it, but that didn't jump back to the IG to send the report to Congress. The director could stop the report from going to Congress. I find that very strange compared to the other IG legislation, and I just don't understand why it was done that way, so that the DRI could actually decide to stop something as opposed to the reverse, which would be that the IG would report directly to Congress.
It is the IG's legal interpretation that without the director's approval, and more particularly over the director's opposition, should the Inspector General provide us with a complaint, that the Inspector General would be at risk of losing his job, security clearance, or subject to reprisal.
Is that, but there are lots of IGs that see themselves as independent, protected by the Senate in particular in their confirmation. Their independence is protected, and the IG law was written in a way to protect the independence of the IGs, and that's why they were given the authority to report directly to Congress as well as to their agency head, but it wouldn't, I spent 8 years as a cabinet officer, it would never occur to me to threaten the IG. That wasn't just me.
I don't know that anyone's threatened the IG, but what the DNI apparently did was go outside of his own agency to solicit a legal
An
opinion.
opinion from
the
the-
Department of Justice and maybe from the White House counsel, we don't know.
Yeah.
That would justify his non-transmittal of the complaint. And apparently the basis that the department gave was such that if it's outside of the jurisdiction of the DNI, it is therefore outside the jurisdiction of the IG, and therefore the IG has no authority to provide it, even though the IG is in full disagreement with that.
I think the only point I'm making is this is totally unprecedented.
Yes, it
In
is.
terms of the role of the IG and what those that drafted the IG legislation had in mind, because they really had in mind an independent inspector general that had the authority to go directly to Congress, whether or not their agency had agreed. And it was the Congress, but the Senate in particular, that would protect the independence of the IG. In this case, I happen to know the IG, who's a very distinguished professional. He's not political at all, even though he was nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And he spent at least a decade, if not more, in the Justice Department. So this is not an inexperienced IG. So while I want to focus on the substance, I do think at some point the Intelligence Committee needs to look at the independence of the IG in this case, because what has happened here is totally unprecedented.
If the representative would yield, Dr. Wenstrup and I are going to need to vote. We're happy to come.
Please,
I'm happy to come back.
you're excused. I think, unless Mr. Desmond had anything he wanted to add, I understand that we're finished. I want to thank both of our witnesses for being here and being so engaged and lively with this. Please leave anything you'd like us to insert in the record so the stenographer can have it. You are now dismissed. Ms. Lesko, did you want to testify on your amendment to H.R. 2203?
I would love to, Mr. Chairman.
All right, you're welcome. You can stay there, or you can, I think you should take the seat here, right? Is that how we do it?
All right, well, if that's what you want me to do.
You're okay. Oh, actually, you're fine there.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Resolution 2203 creates a new ombudsman at DHS to basically serve illegal immigrants. And so my amendment says, "This act shall not take effect unless and until the Secretary of Health and Human Services certifies to the Congress that the homeless population is at or below the national average in all cities in the United States with a population greater than 800,000. And, you know, my amendment basically wants to refocus our attention and our resources to managing our limited resources to improve the lives of our constituents, which are U.S. citizens and legal residents. And so that's what my amendment does, and I ask for your approval.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Do we have copies of the amendment? Has the amendment been distributed? Okay. Okay. So is there, is any further discussion on the Lesko amendment? Okay. All right, seeing none, that closes the hearing. And are there any of the members who wish to testify on H.R. 3525, H.R. 2203, or H.Res. 576? Okay, seeing none, that closes the hearing on those three measures. Okay, and the committee will stand in recess now for 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Did he say 2 minutes?
He did say that, yes.
Okay, are we ready, guys? Okay. Rules Committee will come to order. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement from Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee in support of H.R. 2203. Without objection. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 2203, the Homeland Security Improvement Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Homeland Security. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-27, modified by the amendment printed in the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule also provides for consideration of H.R. 3525, the U.S. Border Patrol Medical Screening Standards Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Homeland Security. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-33 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule further provides for consideration of House Resolution 576, expressing the sense of the House of Representatives with respect to the whistleblower complaint of August 12, 2019, made to the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The rule provides that the resolution shall be considered as read. The rule provides that it shall be in order at any time on the legislative day of September 26, 2019, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules, and that the Speaker or her designee shall consult with the minority leader or his designee on the designation of any matter for consideration pursuant to this section. Section 5 of the resolution provides that on any legislative day during the period from September 30th, 2019 through October 14, 2019, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. The rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 5. Finally, the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 5 shall not constitute a calendar day for the purposes of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution, shall not constitute a legislative day for the purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 13, shall not constitute a calendar or legislative day for the purposes of Clause 7C1 of Rule 22, and shall not constitute a legislative day for the purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 15.
Thank you very much. You've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to provide an open rule. I've not offered many open rules this Congress, but I think these subject matters are on H.R. 2203 and H.R. 3525, subject matters that we all agree need to be addressed. These are partisan solutions, and as such, are not going to move forward, and as such, aren't going to protect the health of migrants, aren't going to protect border control, aren't going to protect the general public. But those are all laudable goals and ones that I believe we can work on together. I propose an amendment to have an open rule so that we can hear from all members on these.
You've heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
A roll call, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas,
Amendment
8 nays.
is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Woodall.
I have a motion to strike from the, an amendment to strike from the rule, Section 3 relating to HRES 576. As I said, I believe there's a bipartisan pathway forward on this issue. I believe we do harm to the balance of powers when we don't achieve that bipartisan pathway, and I would hope that we would strike this section so that we can have that time to find that bipartisan path forward.
What does the section say?
I moved to amend the rule to strike Section 3 of the rule as it pertains to H-Res 576.
I heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
Roll call, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Burgess, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. An amendment to the rule to make an order and provide the necessary waivers to amendment number 19 for H.R. 2203, offered by myself, Ms. Lesko from Arizona. This amendment states that the act shall not take effect unless and until the Secretary of Health and Human Services certifies that the homeless population of large cities in the United States is at or below the national average.
You heard the amendment from the gentlelady. Any discussion or comment? I would just say that I, too, am deeply concerned about any homelessness and about addressing the housing crisis in this country. And it's a heartbreaking problem that needs to be resolved. And that's why I've supported Chairwoman Waters and the Vice Chair of this committee, Mr. Hastings, in their longstanding work to end homelessness. But that's not what your amendment does. It leaves the enactment of this legislation, including the creation of the independent ombudsman at the border, in the hands of HHS Secretary Azar. So one cabinet secretary should not be able to veto the actions of Congress to ensure accountability, transparency, and oversight at our border, and that's something I think we all should be able to agree on. So the vote is now on the Lesko amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Is there any other amendment or discussion? Hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Roll call, please.
And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall?
No.
Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess?
No.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, will manage it for the majority.
And the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Ms. Lesko will manage it for the minority. With no further business, without objection, the committee is adjourned.